Okay, I suggest we get started. Welcome to all of you. My name is Aziza Akmouche. I'm heading at the OECD, the division that deals with cities, urban policy, and sustainable development. And it's really my pleasure to welcome you all to this third and last Mayors panel of the OECD's Champion Mayors Week that started earlier this week on Tuesday. And today's conversation will be addressing the question of could the grass be greener beyond COVID-19? We had yesterday a very interesting mayor's panel on the conversation around reshaping cities and the use of public space, and on Tuesday on the topic of local economic recovery. And I have to say, in both cases, we had a very lively discussion, and I thank all the participants, and I see some of them have also joined today for making this very dynamic. It will be my pleasure to be your co-moderator today, and I will share this task with my colleague Wolfgang Tubner, who's the Regional Director for Europe, Managing Director of ICLEI. ICLEI is one of the supporting institutions of the OECD's Champion Mayors Initiative, which is celebrating this week its 5th anniversary. We've been doing great work with ICLEI over the past few years on many issues related to sustainability, and it's really my pleasure to share the spot with Wolfgang for this hour and a half. I would also like to welcome our 4 distinguished mayors we have online. Mayor Ricardo Rio from Braga in Portugal. Welcome, Mayor. We have Mayor Suzanne Aitken also, the council leader of Glasgow in the UK. We have Mayor Peter Kurz, Mayor of Mannheim in Germany, and we should be joined in a few seconds by Mayor Yvonne Aki-Sawyerr from Freetown in Sierra Leone. Just to tell you all that this webinar is being recorded, that the recording will be made available on the Champion Mayors website later this week. To invite you all to be active throughout the hour and a half. Feel free to drop any question you may have for any of our distinguished panelists, either through the Q&A function or via the chat. If you wish to share links to your work, different initiatives, and to comment on what is being said, feel free to do so. And feel free also to follow us on social media, tweet, retweet using our handle OECD_local hashtag Champion Mayors Initiative. We'll spend a good hour and a half together. We'll start with the first round with the mayors, where they will each tell us about the main hot potatoes that they're struggling with when it comes to environmental challenges today. And then we'll have a discussion that will be moderated by Wolfgang for a good half an hour, a few quick Zoom polls to take the temperature and engage with you, the audience, and then a specific spot also in the session to take some of the questions you are asking. But let me just in 2-3 minutes set the scene for today's conversation and the expectations that we have for this mayor's panel. Many of you have probably figured out that the COVID-19 pandemic in many cases has not revealed new things about the structural issues that our cities, especially the big ones, but not only, are facing, not only in terms of leveraging their productivity, but also in terms of fighting inequality at large, and of course in terms of sustaining and preserving the environment. It has, on the opposite, really acted as a magnifying glass, as a sort of eye-opener, putting on the spotlight problems that have been known for a while. And at the OECD, I must say, we've long been advocating for the concept of green growth, but also for that of inclusive growth, to make sure that the decisions that are actually taken to preserve the planet, to ensure the environmental sustainability, are not disproportionately affecting specific categories of the population, and that the needed economic and policy instruments are actually put in place to mitigate those downside effects on specific parts of the population. And it's true that many of the instruments that we have been advocating for a long period to sustain, to foster environmental sustainability have probably gained today a big momentum. And many of the solutions for that ecological transition that were just either impossible to consider 2 years ago because not socially or politically acceptable, or difficult to fund and to put in place, are actually today gaining a lot of traction in many of the cities. And we've seen many of the initiatives to reduce the weight of individual cars, to make streets more friendly, to reclaim public space, to advance this conversation around decarbonizing our buildings, to transition maybe faster towards a circular economy, that were things we knew had to be done, but that were taking a bit more time to happen. And maybe the conversation, or the combination, better say, of the Greta effect that was already there and the Zoom effect that has been accelerated by this crisis makes many of these solutions today more acceptable than they were just 2 years ago. So there are really 3 things we'd like to hear from the mayors today. First, we'd like to have a sort of quick overview of what are the main issues that they're struggling with and the main short-term responses that they've put in place in this pandemic context to preserve the environment and improve the quality of life of their urban dwellers. We would also like to understand whether there is a chance that some of these measures, through tactical urbanism and so on, will last over time, and whether they think that we have aligned all the planets to actually embark on this radical transformation, not only repackaging that we need to transition to a low carbon economy. And we'd also like to hear how they're working with other stakeholders, with civil society at large, and including other levels of government, because we all know that cities on their own are not going to fix the magnitude of the challenge that is behind the need for environmental sustainability. And that shared responsibility does require multi-level governance and cooperation with a broader range of stakeholders. So this is actually what we are aiming for, and I'm sure the discussion will be extremely lively. And with no further ado, let me now turn back to our first panelist, and it will be you, Mayor Ricardo Rio from Braga in Portugal. If you could please introduce your main environmental priorities. We've seen extremely interesting things in Braga around the bus fleet to provide sustainable and COVID-19 safe public transport, the pedestrianization of historical areas, and also a very interesting momentum around the EU Green Accord. Mayor, you have the floor.
Thank you, Aziza. Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel. Also, greetings to Wolfgang, to Susan, and to Peter, also colleagues from many other quests in other networks and international partnerships. Also to all the attendants to this seminar. I'm the mayor of Braga, as you mentioned, since 2013. I've been appointed as an OECD champion mayor since 2016. And currently I am also a colleague from Susan and Peter, because I'm a member of the Executive Committee of the Global Parliament of Mayors and of the Executive Committee of Eurocities, as well as member of the Committee of the Regions, and also I have been the rapporteur on the Sustainable Development Goals report recently. I think that the sustainability issues were already a priority for my city of Braga before the pandemic. And since I was elected in 2013, we have tried to push the importance not only of these goals, but also of the results that we could achieve under this topic. We've joined ICLEI in the early years of my term. We have been also prioritizing many issues connected with sustainability. For instance, I was mentioning the Sustainable Development Goals, and we've been one of the first cities in Portugal to make the local volunteer assessment of the achievement of the goals, together with the university, the Catholic University CESOP project, which is a partnership with the United Nations so they can produce an annual report for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And obviously, we have to deal with the many of dimensions that are connected with these goals, because Braga is the third most important city in Portugal. So it has a major urban area with around 200,000 inhabitants, but it also has its natural environment. We have a very valuable landscape with some rivers and some mountains, which are obviously let's say the lungs of the city, and obviously something that we have to safeguard in terms of natural environment. But my biggest priority in terms of action in the city has been, as you mentioned, the intervention in terms of sustainable mobility. We have extended throughout the latest years our early policies of having a wide pedestrian zone. Braga in the center has very strict restrictions to the access to automobiles. We have also trying to improve the network of cycling lanes in the city in recent years. But most important than that, we have been challenging the biggest threat that we have here, which is the use of automobiles. And for instance, in the recent Eurobarometer, Braga has been placed as one of the cities that have a more satisfied population, with around 97% of the inhabitants that have been inquired saying that they are happy to live in the city. But also one of the stats that was very remarkable is that most of the inhabitants in Braga like to use their own automobile. They don't question the quality of the public transport service, and actually they value it very positively, but they don't consider it an interesting alternative. So what we have been trying to do in recent years is to put the service of public transport more attractive. And for that, we have made a huge effort, as you mentioned as well, to renew our bus fleet. I have to say that when I was elected in 2013, we had a fleet with an average age of 17 years of age. So it's very damaging for the quality of the air and the air pollution in the city. And up until the middle of this year, we will have 30% of our fleet fully pushed either by electric means or by carbon gas from compressed natural gas in the city. And for the near future, our biggest project, apart from continuing this effort of renewing our fleet, is to implement in the city the bus rapid transit as a revolutionary mode of transport that obviously will attract many more people, be more efficient, and be the source of transformation that we need. As for instance, and that will be my final note in this first intervention, tomorrow we will present our sustainability report, our first sustainability report. And according to the data that we have produced, 65% of the carbon emissions that we have in the city come from transport, come from either the public transport or the use of automobiles by the citizens. So obviously, in our context, this transport issue is the crucial one to reduce the carbon emissions and to fulfill our goals, that is to reduce by 45% the emissions up until 2030, and obviously to achieve the carbon neutrality up until 2050.
Thank you very much, Mayor. Extremely interesting to see how you put transport and urban mobility at the core of your sustainability agenda, and in particular, the emphasis on public transit, because we know this is probably one of the areas that was the hardest hit in terms of the citizens' trust in how safe public transportation has been and will be in the aftermath of the crisis. And I think the way you are pitching it as an attractiveness issue to provide an alternative that is credible to the individual car is very interesting, when we know that individual cars in cities are basically stopped 70% of the time, but that 50% of public space more or less relates to individual cars. So I think in terms of urban planning and multimodal transport, that's a very interesting example. Let me now turn to our second mayor, and it's my my pleasure to introduce Mayor Yvonne Aki-Sawyerr from Freetown. Mayor, I'd like to invite you in 3-4 minutes as well to shed light on the main priority that you are facing from an environmental standpoint in Freetown. We've heard so much about urban farming. We've heard so much about the efforts you're doing in terms of tree planting and anything that can stop the deforestation, but I'm sure you have a lot more ongoing in these COVID-19 days. Mayor, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, and good morning to all my colleagues. It's been really interesting when we talk about this from the perspective of COVID, because from our perspective, a lot of what we're doing now, with the green lens, with the climate action lens or climate mitigation lens, is work that had started already. But I think what COVID has done for us has probably been to challenge access to resources because of the economic slowdown and the fact that many partners, many development partners have seen cuts in their budgets. Although there has been almost everywhere with the EU, with the US, significant investments in a post-COVID recovery, those are rightly so, understandably so, targeted towards their own countries. So I just want to bring that point up, because it's when we talk about climate action and leaving no one behind, and this decade of action, we can't have the conversation without saying, how is it funded? So I just wanted to make that point, that it's really going to be critical that our interventions as cities take into consideration releasing resources to all cities, even those that are in the global south, emerging markets, where perhaps at the national government level, we're not seeing these big interventions, these recovery packages. So that said, what are we doing nevertheless? You already mentioned, Aziza, urban farming and tree planting, but I actually want this morning to focus on two other elements of our strategy, which are critical. I won't say for a green recovery, I'll say for a continued green growth, because we're at a place where we were on a growth trajectory and we need to continue and make sure that the inflections have climate at the heart of them. So I want to start off with transport. And here, our transport figures, our emissions from transport sit around 28%. And they come actually from what would be described as public transport, but public transport with a difference. So inefficient, low occupancy, high emitting public transport is what we had before COVID and what we still have because of a lack of options. So we have over 80% of our populace traveling in public transport, but they are two-wheelers, motorcycles, they are three-wheelers, what many of you will know as tuk-tuks, but they're called kekes here, and they are small taxis and small minibuses. And the average age of the vehicles that are imported into Freetown is 15 years. So they're old, they're poor, they are slow, and there are many. So the emissions are really driven by traffic jams. And by the fact that they're not clean fuel, there are no electric transport solutions here. So in looking at, and the challenge with buses, because the government is working on a bus solution, the central government, but the challenge with buses is the topography and the design of Freetown, or shall I say the lack of design of Freetown, because there has historically not been urban planning. We have many narrow roads and we have many unpaved roads, and we also have a very hilly city where sadly people have been allowed to build without roads being constructed first. So our retrofit solution into that, in order to deal with this and provide a climate solution, a climate-friendly solution, a green solution, which will tackle the mass transit need, is a cable car system. So we've been working for the last almost 2 years now with a combination of stakeholders. We've worked with cable car manufacturers in doing pre-feasibility. We've worked with architects on looking at how the stations can be built so that we are able to create more access for communities which are on the edges of society, therefore bringing more tourism potential, more access to education, more access to jobs, because you're connecting, but at the same time, increasing the value of property, and very significantly, increasing economic productivity. So this is an example of how a green solution can unlock jobs, both directly and indirectly. And what we've gotten is a pre-feasibility study, which is very positive, and where we have become stuck. And this is why I want to bring this question of where does the finance come from, is we've spent almost 1 year now trying to access funding for a full feasibility study. So it's important that we begin to ask ourselves the question, how are we going to ensure that around the world, green solutions can be accessed, which will benefit us all? Because if we want, I mean, we all know this is a highly complex issue, because we have the issue of migration that we often talk about, where people are leaving the global south in some instances simply leaving the rural areas and moving into urban areas, and we have this pressure. And I know that that pressure is felt in Portugal, in Italy, in Germany, in Spain, in Greece. But what are the things that we can do to address these structural issues? Many times they are green solutions because of the fact that a lot of the movement increasingly is climate driven. But then you have a city that is looking to say, I want to better absorb my migrants so that if they come to the city, my city, they stay in my city because there are more jobs, because there's better access, because we're connecting informal communities and bringing more formality to them, and thereby preventing them from going to other places, crossing, doing very unsafe crossings. So it's all interconnected. But what is the key to unlocking them? It's access to funding for green solutions in cities that want to provide green solutions. And this is just one element. Of course, green housing. I say green housing because we're talking about materials, innovations, and alternative materials, so that as my colleagues in the West or in the Northern Hemisphere are talking about retrofitting, because we know that buildings are a major source of emissions, we're also talking about addressing that housing deficit we have here. I'm conscious that time is not on my side, so I'm going to stop here, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mayor, and a very good point made on the funding implications of that green transition. And you've put a spotlight on transport, housing, energy efficiency. Those are classical areas for the decarbonization of our cities. But the point you're making about recovery plans not necessarily trickling down to local and regional governments is something we have also observed in many of the OECD countries. We'll have a chance to go back to that. And this is all the more important as we know local and regional governments were hit very hard in terms of public finance during these COVID-19 days. Thank you very much. Let me now turn to Glasgow, and really delighted to introduce Council Leader of Glasgow, Suzanne Aitken. You are the host of COP26. You are on the spotlight. You need to get this right. I'd like to ask you, Mayor, if you can please flag some of your priorities as Glasgow, but also what you expect from this major convening over the coming month.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. And you're right, the spotlight is on us, and we feel in Glasgow and in Scotland, indeed, a real responsibility to demonstrate leadership and to get this right. And I think events like this, convened by the OECD, as we move towards COP26 and hopefully agreement by national governments of the plans and practicalities for addressing the climate emergency, and as we emerge from the global trauma of the COVID pandemic, these opportunities to collaborate and share experiences have more and more substance and importance. And I think as Ricardo and Yvonne have already identified, the responses to the pandemic are about accelerating real and fundamental change in our cities, fundamental change that was already underway, but focusing minds and accelerating that activity. And certainly in Glasgow, the COVID response and our response to the climate emergency have become inseparable. So today's event asks if the grass will be greener on the other side of COVID, and the answer is that it has to be. We really don't have a choice. If our transition and our recovery isn't green and sustainable and inclusive, then we'll have failed in a fundamental way and missed the opportunities that the tragedy of COVID has presented for us, and that would compound that tragedy in many ways. So none of us can afford to do that. And through the post-pandemic recovery and renewal agendas, we've got an opportunity to target those deep-rooted social inequalities that we've long grappled with and that all of our cities contend with in varying degrees of acuteness and scale. And to accelerate that transition to a net zero carbon future at the same time. And as Yvonne's already identified, the question of who pays for all of this is inextricably tied up with that. It's another way of potentially reinforcing inequalities that we have to avoid if we're going to get this right. We need to think about how this transition is paid for at each step of the way. So in Glasgow, the inequalities that we face are absolutely bound up with our high carbon past and the legacies of our industrial and post-industrial history, which have left a really profound physical and social impact on the health and the quality of life of many of our citizens and communities here in the city. And like others, although we have a number of priorities, the big ones, our big areas of emissions are transport and mobility and heat and buildings. Glasgow's core, our city centre core, really remains as it was designed in the 1800s. It's very beautiful, but it's a rigid grid of streets, and for far too long it has been given over to cars. Congestion and pollution levels are a major public health issue for us, which is particularly inequitable because Glasgow we have the lowest levels of car ownership in the UK. So we're now redesigning our main streets to give priority to people for walking, cycling, wheeling, and also to cleaner public transport, decarbonised buses in particular, making the whole city centre healthier, more attractive, delivering on mobility justice as well as on the climate emergency. And the need for safer physical distancing as we're emerging from the pandemic has accelerated this. And with support from the Scottish Government, we've had temporary bike lanes, pedestrian space, the removal of parking space popping up all over the city. But that's now transitioning into a permanent redesign of public space, along with a major programme of bus prioritisation and decarbonisation and advancing plans for a new metro system. All of that will deliver a modal shift from private cars and better connect poorly served communities to employment, to learning, and to social and leisure opportunities. So we're not just seeking to adapt to and mitigate climate change, but also help transform the lives of residents and communities that need it most. And on buildings, and particularly on the issue of domestic heat, they're also going to be absolutely pivotal to reaching our reduced emissions and net zero targets. And more than arguably any other area of priority, addressing this has the potential to make the biggest inroads into reducing emissions in Glasgow. So the city, along with our neighbouring local authorities in the wider metropolitan city region, are jointly undertaking the necessary feasibility work to explore the scale and scope and the funding of this work right across the city region. It's a combination of retrofitting existing buildings, particularly those historic buildings that were built before 1919, which are an integral part of Glasgow's character as a city, and we definitely don't want to lose them, but we do need to make them much more energy efficient, but also installing renewable energy source heat networks right across all of our domestic properties as well. But this is also, of course, an opportunity to really plan and map and create the skills, the jobs and the economic opportunities that that new green economy is going to require. So in the months ahead, we're going to be working with partners, including particularly with our educational institutions, our universities and colleges, to identify the wider skills and training needs that a new green economy is going to need. The construction sector, this huge programme of building adaptation work is going to be absolutely critical within that, but just one element. But also by making our homes warmer, more energy efficient, we address our citizens' cost of living and in particular fuel and energy poverty, which is one of the most widespread and damaging social injustices that we have in Scotland. So I'll leave it there, again, conscious of time. But I hope those couple of examples demonstrate how the approach that we are taking is very much focused on that greener recovery, green transition, but ensuring that social justice, addressing the inequalities that we've long grappled with, are part and parcel of that. And indeed, one can't happen without the other. And if we do, we risk having a regressive transition and reinforcing inequalities, and that's the last thing that any of us want to do, particularly as we emerge from a pandemic which has laid bare some of the long-standing inequalities that we have in all of our cities. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mayor. And I think this was a beautiful illustration of what we would call the co-benefits of the green transition. And I think the spotlight you've put on not only mitigating the divides that this is exacerbating in terms, in particular, of some of the economic instruments and taxation mechanisms used to support that transition, but also, on the other hand, generating opportunities, jobs, new skills, and drivers for growth is really spot on. So thank you very much, and also for the very concrete illustration on the buildings dynamics. This is a topic that is gaining a lot of traction, in particular in the new teleworking era, where I believe there is a risk that the responsibility for the decarbonization of buildings be just transferred, let's say, to households and residential buildings, when actually there's a much higher commitment to be made for all forms of buildings, including public ones. So thank you for that. And let me now turn to our last but not least speaker for this first round, Mayor Peter Kurz from Mannheim in Germany. If you could share with us some of your priorities, and we've been very interested to see the climate urgency plan and many other initiatives you've taken in Mannheim, cycling infrastructure and way beyond. Please, Mayor, tell us what keeps you busy these days in terms of this green agenda and what's coming ahead for Mannheim.
Yeah, thank you, Cesar Agmush, and dear colleagues. I could make it very short. I totally agree with all what my colleagues have said. Referring to your first question and the main question of our meeting, could the grass be greener on the other side of COVID-19? I think we all agree, definitely yes. And let me add that Susan Aitken mentioned this already. Greener grass means not only a greener environment, but also a more equitable society. And let me refer to your question of multi-level governance. I think we all are very engaged to realize a real multi-level governance. And that means that we are not just a level of implementation. We have to have influence in designing the policy. So, for example, we tried as German European cities to influence the recovery plan of Germany. And it wasn't possible to have a direct dialogue between the federal government and the cities. And this is obviously a problem if we look to our city. We have now published a study about decarbonization, that it is possible, of course, but we realize that it's not possible to do it by own means. So we need a regulatory framework. Of course, we need a lot of money to do this. And so if we want to meet our goals, we have to have really a coherent program between the different levels of government to, as I said, meet our goals. During the last 15 months, we were forced to act responsively and with agility to fight the pandemic, and we learned that more change is possible. I think this is something which became pretty clear also to the public, and which is now a basis to go really a step further. For example, in Mannheim, we grounded our work in our mission statement, Mannheim 2030. And we developed this mission statement 2019 in a participatory process involving 2,500 residents. And in some aspects now we have become even more ambitious, and we will update our mission statement. For example, in one of the pillars of our mission statement is a commitment to becoming a climate friendly, and now in the much shorter term, climate neutral and resilient city that is a model for environmentally friendly life and actions, even though we are a highly industrialized city. Our mission statement also serves as a blueprint for our environmental priorities, and we are especially committed to accelerating our green transition in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic. We have identified several key areas during the pandemic where we are focusing our attention and resources, and there are already mentioned from my colleagues. Two of our top priorities are low emission mobility and changing public space. Actually, Mannheim is the birthplace of the bicycle. We are proud of this heritage and committed to making our green city more bike friendly by closing traffic network gaps and providing more parking spots and facilities for bicycles. Last July, we made municipal funding available for a program that subsidizes the purchase of cargo bikes, making biking a more family-friendly transportation option. In August, we will interrupt and partially close two main roads crossing our city center, which has also a rigid grid as Glasgow from the 17th century, and transform parts of the roads to green space, playgrounds and restaurant terraces. We are still the shopping center of an area with 2 million inhabitants. And so this will have an impact, I think, of the concept of the city for the whole region if we do so. Our green mobility approach is also connected to our housing policy. From now on, building owners will be required to offer parking spots protected from weather and theft for bicycles. Our mission statement also highlights the development of green spaces to protect the climate and support biodiversity. And we will use the German Federal Garden Show in 2023 to highlight these issues: climate, environment, energy, and food security. This will be the four main topics. And in this way, we will use these green spaces to teach locals and visitors about key environmental issues. And after the event is over, we will have new and biodiverse green spaces that our residents can enjoy and benefit for decades to come. Our priorities are interlinked, and we try to give green technology a great deal of thought. In April, we were awarded European and regional grants for Green Tech Startup Center, which will be built up within the next 2 years. And our work goes beyond our city limits. Last October, Mannheim, together with ICLEI, Wolfgang Teubner, hosted the 9th European Conference on Sustainable Cities and Towns. And at the end of the conference, cities across Europe signed the Mannheim message committing to localizing the European Green Deal. Of course, we took this seriously and established in our city a team working on developing a local Green Deal together with our citizens and stakeholders from the business, industry, research, and innovation sectors here in Mannheim within the next weeks and months. And of course, for that, we need the support of our state of Baden-Württemberg and our federal government and maybe the European Union. We hope to transform our city, but also serve as an example for other cities. And as we all know, cities have real power to affect change. To take bold action is our responsibility, but the more cities that do the same, the easier it gets for all of us.
Thank you very much, Mayor Kurz of Mannheim in Germany. Extremely interesting, and I'll just ask you a question, and if you keep it for later in the Q&A. You did mention multi-level governance and what you're doing with the federal level and the lender level, but there's an increasing scale in Germany with the metropolitan regions, and within the Rhine-Neckar metropolitan region also there are some planets being aligned and forces being joined for this sustainable development agenda. So anything that cuts across the administrative perimeters and is based more on the functional area of where people actually work and live, I think could be inspiring for other cities. But keep that for you. I'll now hand over to my colleague Wolfgang Töbner, the Director General for Europe, for the moderation of the second part of the webinar. Wolfgang, you have the floor.
Thank you, Aziza. Good morning, everybody, again from my side. And thank you also for the very interesting insights and contributions. Maybe to start with, we are living in a very special time, and as you all basically related to COVID. I mean, one question would of course be, in how far you were using, or COVID was providing an opportunity to leverage and to accelerate more climate-friendly policy, and also how is your point of view in regarding when we are getting out of the pandemic? Would we potentially see rebound effects? We see tourism coming back, we have seen reduced mobility, but we see now also industry pushing people back into offices. So how can you also make sure, of course, that these policies are then sustained basically over a longer time? And what is your perspective on that? Maybe who would like to start to maybe go? Let ladies go first. Mayor Sawyerr, it's you have a particular, of course, perspective on these issues also from the global south. So. Have you had any advantages even from the situation in that sense?
Yeah, so thank you, Wolfgang. I think it's important to note that as to date, we still have below 2,500 COVID cases in total in the city, and we have 79 deaths. So our COVID experience is very different. And this is one of the things that we've always got to keep in mind when we're talking about local actions for global ambition, the fact that the local contexts are so different. So when we talk about, in response to your question, would there be a rebound in which it's really around the measures, so we haven't had lockdowns. We had 2-3-day lockdowns in the entire period. We had a curfew for a number of months, which was from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., which really wouldn't have had any impact in terms of people's actions or from a climate angle. So that's why I keep kind of coming back to the fact that I'd like to think about this more from the perspective of us being on a growth trajectory and having an inflection where there is an opportunity to have different conversations, but there haven't been the sorts of measures. Yes, people are wearing masks, but not, it's not closure of, it's not home working, it's not shutting down of public transport. It's not these major interventions where you can then say, so what happens now? Clearly, we have seen a fall in our very fledgling tourism market that was, that was being promoted. We've seen that, but it's more important from us, our perspective, to think about what we did, for example, with water. So water is a major constraint. Informal settlements, the spotlight came very strongly on the challenge of informal settlements in a pandemic, being able to access water. The urban farming was also as a response to the thought of us potentially having lockdowns. It didn't happen, but the urban farming interventions did happen. And we've been inspired to do more of them, to actually grow this. So I suppose you could say, what did COVID highlight and cause us to do that we will now do more of? Water shortages, a major challenge. We accelerated access to water. But perhaps our conversation now, as the rains approach and we see deforestation already having a devastating impact. So the Meteorological Agency has announced last week that we're going to fall well below our normal rainfall. And with that will also come increased storms, wind storms, and there have been in the last 2 weeks, storms that have knocked down schools, knocked down, PHUs, peripheral health units. So we're seeing the climate impact. And I would say again that what we need to continue to do is look for the resources to allow the climate action, mitigation, and adaptation to be in place. And we talk about this is the decade of change. If you don't release resources, if it takes me a year and a half and I still have not accessed resources for a major climate initiative, then on the global level, something isn't going right. Because this is going to be happening not just to me. So I think us being able to have a confluence of this rhetoric of urgency and match it with some more innovation and more transparency, more accessibility for climate-friendly action. The other thing which is so important, Peter was talking about decisions that he's made about closing down streets, pedestrianizing them, making them bike-friendly. We have yesterday, finally, after 3 years of advocating for the Local Government Act to be implemented in respect of devolution of land use planning and building permit, we finally got a response from the government, and the answer is no. So here I am, in charge of a city, and I can't even tell you where houses or buildings are going to be built. Local government is not responsible for building permits. The most basic and important land use planning, the most basic and important tool in urban management, and a tool which is super critical when you're looking at urban management from the perspective, from the building materials, the building controls, the regulations, what streets are pedestrianized. If you at the city level cannot influence that, then where do we start? And where you have a situation where the national government may be ticking boxes in terms of, supplying NDCs, but you're not seeing that. We're seeing timber logging jumping up to the biggest revenue earner for the government, and now our biggest exporter in the middle of a climate crisis, where we're talking about deforestation leading to, real-time damage to livelihood and homes and pushing rural migration. Where are we having these conversations about the reality of what is going on in thousands of cities in parts of the world, which are going to impact what goes on in your parts of the world? These things cannot be swept under the carpet. They can't be minimized, because the impact is already real, and it will continue to be real, and it will continue to impact what you're trying to do. So we need to have these conversations around national, local authority mandates around financing. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, for your also very engaged answer here. Let me quickly also go back, of course, to Mayor Rio, because you also said, I mean, you know, pedestrianizing, you know, buses, reducing individual mobility, and certainly, I mean, as we also, you know, heard, lockdowns and, you know, patterns, of course, helped also maybe to find some acceptance or to use the opportunity. But how do you see this evolve also after basically, you know, the pandemic and the recovery in your city?
Oh, Wolfgang. First of all, I think that the biggest transformation that we had because of the pandemic was the twist to nature. That is, as I mentioned, even in a city like Braga, the valuing of our natural resources, let's say, the exploitation, the discovery of our natural environment, even by the local citizens, which usually didn't value that much, and obviously also in terms of touristical promotion. Usually Braga will be attractive because of its heritage, because of its many activities. And in recent times, we have tried to put in spot also those resources that are more connected with the landscape, with river beaches and many other sites that we have, for instance, like the pedestrian trails for people in the mountains that have been explored not only by visitors, but also by local residents that didn't explore that much that reality in the past. I think that in the other dimensions, for instance, as you mentioned, the use of public space, that wasn't really a twist, because we have been betting a lot in that dimension. As I used to say, we looked at the city center as the city as a stage. That is, we use the public space already for many economic activities, for cultural events, for sports events. And what we did throughout the COVID pandemic was to extend that use of public space also for other dimensions. For instance, we were not pioneers, because many other cities also did that throughout the latest months. But for instance, allowing the extension of terraces for coffees, for restaurants, so that the people will stay more safe, and obviously will have more space in plazas, in the areas close to their sites, was very important, because obviously that was a safety measure, but also an opportunity for extending the benefits for those companies that were so threatened throughout this period. And for instance, we allowed gymnasiums to use public parks to give classes to their clients, so that they will obviously have more space and have free air, also to have more safety conditions for that activity. So I think that in that sense, we didn't make a revolution throughout this period. We also tried to strengthen some trends that were already being implemented in the city, and that I think that will last for the future as well. But I have to stress one issue that has already been mentioned by Peter and also by Yvonne, that I agreed, because I did it in my first intervention, which has to do with this issue that Aziz also questioned about the multi-level governments and the relation between the different levels of governance. Because what I think is that in the pandemic, instead of having a new paradigm of relation between the different levels of governance, I think that the reality, which is quite isolated activity by each of the levels of governance, in which the local authorities, instead of complementing the responsibilities of the national government, usually replace the responsibilities of national government, has been even more stressed. And I think that in many domains throughout the latest months, we have shown all over the world, and I have been sharing experiences with mayors from all the continents, in every single site, the local authorities were crucial to the response to the pandemic, even not having the other issue that is always on the table in this discussion, which is the funding for doing what we have done. And I think that for the future, the discussion on decentralization processes, the discussion on the sharing of resources is always a top priority for these issues.
Thank you, Mayor Rio. I think we will come back to that aspect anyway in the discussion. I would, before I continue with Mayor Aitken, I would quickly just introduce also a question from the audience into that. And this was also, I mean, we are currently discussing, you know, changes also, of course, particularly accessibility and use of public space. And there is a question relating how inner cities, you know, can be, you know, changed basically also in their function from being mostly shopping centers to more, you know, productive and, you know, I would say multifunctional local communities. I don't know in how far that, you know, Mayor Aitken, that is also basically part of the concept that you're following through in Glasgow when you look at these issues.
Yes, it is absolutely, and it's a really important question. I think, a theme that's come through in each of our contributions has been that none of this is reinventing the wheel. None of it is new. What it is accelerating work that we've already been doing in our cities, and I think perhaps focusing that work on and the, you know, what is done is make it clear where our priorities need to lie, I suppose. But so we had already started in Glasgow on that process of rethinking our city centre, which has been very retail focused for the past 30 years or so. And clearly retail was already on a trajectory which had changed it forever. And it wasn't, you know, we can't uninvent the internet. We're not going to uninvent online shopping. So retail already had to change, but that has accelerated in the past year exponentially, you know, enormously, and a huge change. Yvonne was talking about the differential impacts of COVID on different cities in different parts of the world. And in Glasgow, in actual fact, we currently have a COVID spike, an outbreak in the south side of the city where I live. And the city of Glasgow is currently under stricter restrictions than anywhere else in Scotland. So I'm working from home just now, but I can't go into someone else's home, for example, whereas other people in Scotland are now able to do that. I hope that within a week or two, our restrictions will ease as well. So we're not under lockdown. You know, we're able to move around much more freely than we were, but we are still under significant restrictions. So our city centre is under enormous pressure. Actually, it's our businesses are having a kind of existential crisis. So the need to rethink and to accelerate the work that we were doing beforehand on making our city centre much more residential. On Glasgow was depopulated about between 50 and 30 years ago. There was a deliberate decision made to depopulate the city, which we look back on now as I think it's one of the most crazy policy decisions that's ever been applied, and the city lives with a legacy of that to this day. So we are repopulating parts of the city that were previously depopulated. Along with that, we have to provide public services. So our city centre doesn't have a school, it doesn't have dentists, it doesn't have doctors' surgery. So all of those things have to be planned and provided for this new city centre urban, very urbanised population. That's all great. Alongside that, mixed use, we've already seen the city centre shift more toward parts of it towards the experience consumerism, if you like. So cultural experiences, restaurants, and a more specialised form of retail, which is more unique rather than chain stores. And that's the direction of travel. So retail won't go away forever. But alongside that, we've seen a real emergence, and Ricardo talked about the rediscovery of nature. That's something that we've seen hugely in Glasgow as well. Glasgow's already a very green city. In fact, the name Glasgow comes from a Scots Gaelic word which means green place. and we have more than 90 public parks in the city. 70% of our population live in apartments, so they don't have access to gardens. So those parks have become even more important. The importance that has been placed on them by our citizens is, has risen enormously over the past year, particularly when the full lockdown was in place and we had that stay-at-home order. So that focus on our green spaces has become even more important. But also a different way of thinking about green spaces. I talked about our city centre still being that 1800s Victorian model, but so are many of our parks. They have a kind of, that sort of manicured approach. They're very, they're not wild places. And so we've got a shift in thinking as well about what green space is for and what it looks like. So we are wilding the city as well as greening the city much more than we were before. And that's a shift in attitude. But also this whole idea of 20-minute neighbourhoods has come into play, because people have had to rediscover their local places because they weren't allowed to go into the city centre, and because office workers weren't going in, and people were working at home. Everyone has rediscovered their local places, so that's become incredibly important as well. That we have a problem there in that local neighbourhoods, the one that I live in, is thriving. They're busy. We see local coffee shops and bars and restaurants and local shops doing really well, but meanwhile our city centre is struggling badly, and that city centre is the most important area of economic activity in Scotland, the whole country. It's not just for the city. It supports 170,000 jobs. That's not counting supply chains. It is our biggest, most important urban centre. So the recovery of our city centre is crucial to our green recovery and to our social justice recovery. But it needs to be a different kind of recovery, and it needs to accelerate all of those changes that were already taking place. And just briefly on that, relationship between national and local government, I think I've seen a real transition in Scotland where there have always been tensions between local and national government, and the funding issues have made those more acute in recent years. But because we're a small country, we have no choice but to work together. We're only 5 million of a population. But over the past year, national government has seen the value of local government more than they ever have before. The national response simply could not have been delivered without local government. So I'm hopeful, and I see already a real change in that relationship taking place, where local government is becoming more valued.
Sorry to, but we're a bit pressured for time, but great answer. Thank you very much, and very touching on a lot of really important issues here. I would like to quickly switch back, and you already introduced that question of the multi-level governance, if I may, Aziza. The point here is, I mean, we're the whole climate negotiations are currently based on the nationally determined contribution, the NDCs, but also I think you, Mayor Kutz, already alluded to that you don't see that cities are necessarily involved in an appropriate way, I would say, in these developments, and also I think it was raised in several ways how the the fiscal transfers of financial support is working. So, from your perspective, what would you say, is maybe the most important changes that you would potentially expect, from your perspective as a mayor that is also, of course, internationally engaged, to say, how needs that to change in order to really support cities in line with their role and responsibility for the transition?
I think really that changing the role of cities is a prerequisite for all the global goals we have: climate change, a peaceful society, a more equitable society, and so on. For all these goals, the cities or the local level is really needed and has to have the potential, the resources, and the jurisdiction to act properly. And so, of course, it's in a way on the same level as the big overarching goals that we should address a bit more on the international level, because I'm really convinced, as I said, it's a prerequisite. And especially, I mean, the OECD could be very helpful to stress this point, also from a scientific point of view. So in Europe, we have at least the Charter of Local Self-Government. This is a great basis, although it's not realized within Europe in a way we want to have it. But we failed to have this on a global level. So a charter for local self-government would be an important step, not because satisfying mayors, but to meet our goals. And this connection is underestimated and underrated. So I think we should promote this idea. And of course, the issues we now discuss are the ones we need right now. A real multi-level governance, which means that we are involved in the programming. So there is a kind of, let's say, awareness on the international level. It's more a problem, let's say, on the national level. So if we speak to the European Union or to UN Habitat or whatsoever, they know that the cities are very important and have to be strengthened. But that on the national level, the situation is different. So we have to try to increase the pressure from the international side and the local side on the national governments to change their attitude and their approach towards the local level. So this is really, for me, would be a giant step or leap to really boost our ability to address the important issues we all discuss. Also, so if we bring it down to the questions we discussed, for example, the housing sector, on the one hand, or in our case, we have a chance because more than 60% of our houses are related to a district heating system. And now we have to change this from a coal-based district heating system to a green-based district heating system. And this means, of course, that we need a regulatory framework, that we need a kind of funding. For the rest, we need to double the rate of renovation. We have now a renovation rate of 1.3%, and we would need far more than 2. So for that, we would need local money, or we would need a statewide program to foster this. And this we have to discuss on eye level, what we can do from bottom up and top down. It must be both. And so we have our local plans, and we can, and if you would combine all the local plans, you would see the differences, and you would see how you have to adjust your regulatory framework to really address all the different situations in cities. So this is the kind of approach we need now, and there is a sense of urgency, but I still think that this topic has not the same state of urgency, because it's not so much visible. It's there is not the same, the same feeling about this issue, because it's not so visible. So it's much better than 2 years ago, but still there's a way to go. And if we have in mind that 2030 is really the big date when the things have to have changed. So the time is now. So it's not about speaking about to have a multi-level governance in 2030. We need it now to have another world in 2030. So, and just let me add one remark to the question of Aziza Akmouch. I think this would be would need another meeting to go into detail. But I think it's really interesting that the task to define what is a city is still a task, and we don't have an answer yet. And there should have been an answer, I think, last year. So Europe wanted to provide for the UN a definition of what is a city. And this is also a governance issue. It's not, it's different than the multi-level governance issue. I wouldn't mix these two issues, but it's important. And in our case, so we have now a project with OECD as the Rhein-Neckar metropolitan region, where we belong to. I think it will be an interesting question, and I hope that we come to this if our metropolitan region is really an urban functional area. I think it is not. Maybe we consist of 2 or 3 different urban functional areas, and of course we consist of much more cities. So there's a difference between the region and the city and the urban functional area, and what would that mean in terms of governance? So this is really an important issue for also, not for the future, but for now. But we are far away to have a solution. But it's really a very interesting topic. So I want to underline the importance of this question.
Thank you, Mayor Kurz. And with that, I kindly hand back a bit later than expected to Aziza. Thank you very much for your great answers here.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang. Fantastic, very nice discussion. And now we'll transition to 2 Zoom polls. And I would like to invite all the dozens of participants. We have almost 85 people online now to respond to these. 2 questions. One is pretty straightforward. Do you think COVID-19 has raised awareness on environmental sustainability in your city? That's a yes/no question. And second poll, which is asking you to pick your top climate priority. I know you could tick all the boxes out there. You have to select one of them, the top climate priority in your city, whether it's adaptation to climate change and reducing risks, including floods, heat waves, and so on. Investing in skills and green jobs for the future, improving, building energy efficiency, anything that relates to sustainability for mobility, public transport, increasing vegetation cover or nature in city, anything else other, and then you could drop us some suggestions in the chat if this is not captured. And I see we have a good half of participants who have voted already. We'll go for an extra 10 seconds and then we will share the results with you all, and then I would suggest maybe Wolfgang that you take over and maybe seek some of the mayor's feedback on what comes out of the poll for a good 10 minutes max, and we'll close. So if the team is ready, I think we have a quorum. Let's share the results. An overwhelming majority, almost 90%, saying yes, COVID-19 has raised awareness. I think this is consistent with what many of the mayors were saying in the earlier sets of panels, things we knew, but that gained momentum basically, and things we've long been working on, but that had a window where maybe it was easier to implement some of these measures. And then in terms of the climate priorities, very interesting to see the emphasis on green jobs and skills indeed, because we always hear the let's say traditional sectoral approach to focus on specific urban policy sectors, from housing to transport to energy efficiency and so on. And this really as a cross-cutting driver to fit for the future, including in terms of jobs and in this era of automation and so on, is very interesting that local governments and residents have expressed expectations in that regard. So I'll leave you here with the polls, and back to you, Wolfgang, for an extra 10 minutes. Any question, please, the audience, feel free to use the Q&A, drop questions on the chat. Now is your time, and then we'll wrap up in 10 minutes.
Thank you, Aziza. And yeah, I mean, I quickly would just like to give you basically the opportunity to react. I mean, what we see is, I mean, I think in all of your contributions in the beginning, we heard transport, we heard housing, we heard jobs. So obviously you do a good job in basically seeing what the priorities are. So that should be quite calming for you then. But any first reactions? Maybe start a bit back forth. So Mayor Kutz, do you have any reactions or comments to this outcome, and what can you actually do, and also in terms, of course, as a city relating to skills and education? I mean, what is your responsibility, and how can you support this then, for example?
In recent years, we experienced that even if we don't have any jurisdiction towards our universities, there is a much more intensified connection between the city and the university, dealing with the future. So right now we have new master programs for sustainable management, for example, which is established right now. And so there's a change going on in that direction. We addressed the issue also, of course, in our startup centers. So there is a postgraduate kind of education related to, and we also addressed the youth. What we should emphasize more, frankly, is the schools itself. This, in our case, is also not our jurisdiction in Germany, but I think there's a possibility also to influence, of course, as a city, the schools in taking up the issue. So yeah, I found it very interesting that the participants really focused on the issue of education.
Thank you. Maybe quickly back to Yvonne Sawyer here. I mean, you also said this, but you connected this, of course, also to your challenges in principle to make this accessible for people. But as we are basically a round of mayors, do you see also any potential basically to support this agenda based on a city-to-city cooperation here? Mayor Sawyer, do you?
Yes, no, the city corporation is really a valuable one. In fact, I'm going to be working with I'm working with the Mayor of Mannheim on a city-to-city corporation, which actually is focused on urban planning. And I think this is just another example, because we have to understand now how, well, we will still be able to do something, and we will still be able to leverage that that interface. But the challenge of this interface with the national governments it's really one that we can't overemphasize. And I saw a question in the chat saying, the question was, what do we do about it as we go to COP? And with all lobbying and with all negotiations, I suppose the short answer is that we need to keep talking about it. I mean, Peter mentioned that it's something that is often not brought to the fore, and yet it can be such an obstacle to what the role that cities are playing, or the potential that cities have not being fully utilized. And we saw this in the migration conversations when the compact was being agreed without cities at the table, and we're seeing it again. And COVID, as Susan said, COVID has demonstrated that cities really can make a difference, and cities are making a difference. But we need to allow the potential of cities to be fully utilized. And you know, I think Ricardo again said the same thing. So this is clearly a problem which cuts across all of us. Maybe the scales differ, you know, the level of severity differs, but the problem is there. So maybe if there's one big takeaway from me out of today's conversation, can the grass be greener on the other side? It would be to say it would be more green if we could deal effectively with the issues of interface with national governments. As others have said, the international community, the supranational, get it now. But at our national level, we still have these blocks, and that is tied directly to access to funding.
So, Mayor Aitken, would you like to come in here? Also, you know, as basically a particular role, maybe, you know, as being the host for COP26, and I know that you're also engaged in the financing discussions anyway. So maybe you have a first reaction here as well.
And yes, I think you know, it was good to see those responses in the poll that the priorities are shared. I think a couple of reactions, and both Peter and Yvonne have already touched on it, but building on it, the whole thing around financing and the idea of just transition. We are going to be collectively, public and private sectors, national and local government, spending a huge amount of money over the next decade, billions and billions of dollars, euros, pounds, whatever, in order to finance this transition. The things that we're talking about doing, retrofitting thousands and hundreds of thousands of buildings, you know, green infrastructure, major green infrastructure, turning roads into waterways, whatever it is that people are doing, none of this is cheap, huge amount of money. And I think we have a responsibility within that to ensure that every single dollar that's spent has multiple impacts. So that when we spend on something like one of the projects we are very interested in progressing in Glasgow is a tidal barrier for our River Clyde, which will both mitigate flooding and open up vacant and derelict land, and also allow us to use the river for renewable energy sources. That's a multi-million pound project. Every single pound that we spend on that, we also need to ensure that it delivers just transition, that it grows skills, that it reskills In Scotland, just transition is often talked about in the context of our oil and gas sector, which is very important. But Peter was absolutely rightly talking about the journey through the education system, from schools, colleges, universities, and ensuring that that is equipping our young people for the new green economy, and that we have curriculums and qualifications and skills that will be sustainable for people in the future. But right now, we also have, for example, motor mechanics who work with diesel engines. We have engineers who service the natural gas fossil fuel boilers that most people in Scotland heat their homes with. Their jobs, we're seeking to make those jobs obsolete within the next decade, very, very quickly. And these are not old people, they're not going to retire. So this is an older population, people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, who we have an obligation to ensure that they are not left behind by this transition. We have, and it links in strongly with the Green Deal that Peter's pioneered in Mannheim, and we are also doing a local version of in Glasgow. And the idea of community wealth building, of using our procurement power, our spending power as a public authority, which is considerable, but combining that with other spending power of our health service, of our universities, that's a lot of money. If we use that to support local businesses to transition to a low carbon future, to build resilience for them, if we use that to ensure reskilling and upskilling for people who are facing obsolescence in their jobs over the next decade, that's something really, really important. And so we're spending all of this money. Let's make that money work on multiple levels for the environment, but also for citizens and communities.
Thank you. So we are coming to the end, but we cannot close. We have opened with Mayor Rio, so we will close with a final reaction by Mayor Rio. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Wolfgang. That's a huge responsibility, and after all these very interesting interventions of my colleagues, I will maybe stress some issue that hasn't been so enhanced in this discussion, which is the inclusiveness of this dimension. And obviously, when we talk about the green transformation, one of the biggest challenges, for instance, and it was one of the topics that in the quest was considered very important, is the energy efficiency of use of buildings, for instance. And that's one of the areas in which we have to apport more support to, for instance, low-income households, so that they can make the investments that are needed to have a more efficient use of energy in their residences. But also the mention to the green jobs, I think it's a way to stress that all these efforts aren't a cost for the society. They can be an opportunity in terms of economic growth. And one thing that we have been trying to do in Braga is always to foster new business opportunities together with the knowledge centers, together with the universities in the green areas, so that new jobs and new companies can be created, and that obviously overall the society can gain for not only in terms of sustainability, but also in terms of economic development and growth.
Thank you. And over to Aziza for closing the session.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Wolfgang. Thank you very much, Mayor Rio, Mayor Kurz, Mayor Aitken, Mayor Aki-Sawyerr. Really, it was a fascinating conversation, and we'll keep the conversation going, including tomorrow in the closed door meeting of the champion mayors of the OECD's Champion Mayors Initiative for Inclusive Growth, that is celebrating its 5th anniversary this week, and that we'll discuss discuss lessons on inclusive growth from all 64 mayors over the past 5 years and have a specific spotlight on the youth. Mayors endorsing a pledge for the youth in this recovery. And I look forward very much to the conversation and your participation. We have shared a number of web links via the chat. If you wish to know more from the audience on what we do with Champion Mayors, anything that relates to our work on climate, on the circular economy, on energy efficiency in buildings, sustainable mobility, name it, any of these urban policy challenges are subject to a full-fledged program at the OECD. Let me thank you all for your wisdom. We were so thrilled to pick your brains today and discuss these very complicated issues of funding, not only attracting sources of finance, but also minimizing in investment needs in many cities with nature-based solutions, other green infrastructure, multi-purpose infrastructure as well. So it's not only about pouring more money, it's also about minimizing the need for funding. And I think what was also said around procurement and the potential of procurement is very, very spot on. And we've heard also a lot about multi-level governance. There is something in between the city and the national, this functional urban area, this intermunicipal cooperation that many of you are also tapping into, and great to see also the traction still out there on the SDGs. We actually are shaping high-level principles on city-to-city partnerships within the G20, which may be of interest to many of you. We have a dedicated roundtable on cities and regions for the SDGs next 29th and 30th of June. Keep an eye on the webpage of the OECD. Thank you so much. Really, Wolfgang, it was a pleasure to share the spot with you, and we look forward to much more work with ICLEI. Remember, the recording is available online, and with this, I formally close the webinar, thanking all mayors for their time and all participants for joining. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.